演讲即将开始。Our next speaker is Jonathan. Jonathan is the author of Koa as well as the spiritual successor to Express, which is also written by TJ Howard-Chak. And in the following talk, he will discuss first problems that arise from creating apps with callback-based programming, such as Express. Second, complexity of other frameworks due to callback-based programming. And the third one is how to philosophically build your Koa apps. Let's welcome him right now.
I'm John. I'm here to talk about Koa. So if you guys don't know, Koa is written by TJ Howard-Chak, and who also wrote Express. So this is basically the next version of Express. So I don't know how much experience you guys have with Node, but Node consists of a lot of callbacks. So to properly use Node callbacks, you have to handle all your errors. So here is an example of handling my errors. But this is very annoying when you have a lot of callbacks. You gotta handle every single error, or otherwise you're gonna have a lot of bugs in your code. The solution is to have bug-free code, which is really difficult to learn and to do. Another problem with callbacks is you can't use try-catch. So here's an example where set immediate is basically a callback, and you're throwing an error within the callbacks. But if you try to do try-catch, it's not going to work. And what's going to happen is your whole process, your whole app is going to die. So when you're actually deploying a site, you do not want this to happen. And if you use callbacks a lot, you're going to end up with a pyramid of callback doom, which is basically you're going to have a lot of nested functions and callbacks, which is not fun. And there's also conditionals, which I didn't even want to show, but basically it's really hard to only do an asynchronous callback with a certain. Basically, it's hard to do ifs and callbacks together. So there are a few solutions to callbacks. The first is to do a lot of refactoring and create bug-free code, which is very difficult to do, and it takes a lot of time and knowledge to learn. Then it's you use a lot of control flow libraries, such as Async. There are a lot of multiple of these. There's domains provided with core, Node core, but this is going to be deprecated soon, so you should not use domains. A lot of frameworks and libraries use domains, but I don't know what they're going to do when it gets taken out. And the last and final solution is Promises, which is in ES6. So what is Promises? I explained it. But basically what Promises is you have asynchronous, you abstract an asynchronous call into an object, and you pass the object reward. So the great thing about Promises is that it's native to JavaScript. Most browsers after IE12, which is always last, is going to have Promises natively. And Node has Promises in the latest unstable version. So right now to use Promises, you have to use unstable version of Node. And we're waiting for Node version 0.12 to have Promises. But the problem with Promises is very confusing. It took me like 2 weeks just to understand what Promises was, which is more than a lot of other concepts in JavaScript. So in ES7, which is going to come out next year, we could finally write asynchronous code like synchronous. So this might look confusing to you, but what it basically is a special type of function called an async function. And what you have is, suppose Node returns promises, which they don't plan to do anytime soon, which sucks. But assuming they return promises, you could do asynchronous calls. So suppose fs.stat returns a promise, you can await it and get the value like synchronous code. If you're coming from I think C#, I don't think anyone uses that, but there's a lot of similar ideas in different languages. I think Golang has one, which I guess they call it channels. So basically, you're writing asynchronous code like synchronous. And the great thing is that you could actually use try and catch. So you don't have to handle all your errors in every time. You can just try and catch them. So the great thing about async await is that you would rarely ever have to actually use promises. So creating promises is very confusing, and using promises is confusing. But when you have async await, you're just using the promises without actually using the promise API, which is very confusing. And that's like the greatest thing about ES7 and async await. So we're almost there right now with generators. So this is what Koa is, which is what Koa is based off of. This is also written by TJ Holloway Chuck, and I helped him maintain this. So if you look at the code before, it's basically very similar. But instead of using an async function, you have a generator function that co-wraps. And instead of await, you have yield. So here, assuming no return promises again, you basically have the same code. Fstat returns a promise, you can yield it, and you get the value semi-synchronously. It looks like synchronously. And you can also try and catch all your errors. So this is what code is, written by TJ Holloway Chuck. It's community maintained. So there's me, there's TJ, and this other guy who's Chinese, I don't know his real name. He goes by Decorators on GitHub. He uses code, and he uses the exact same modules as Express. So if you look here, this is like all the low-level modules maintained by both Express team and the Koa team. So the idea that, I don't know how much of you guys know Express, but Express uses callbacks as the middleware. So in Koa, every single middleware is a generator function. So this is how a middleware would look like. You would have so this is my version of Node's API, which basically just wraps everything into a promise. And so basically I could read a file, yield it. Since this becomes a return to promise, I could simply yield it, and I could set that as a response body. So this is, if you compare it to Express or any other framework, it's very simple. So unlike any other framework, you can actually use try-catch. And if you're coming from like a Ruby or something, you're more used to try-catch versus all this callback stuff. So here's an example. I'm setting the body as a file, but if for some reason the file doesn't exist, or maybe there's like a hardware error, you can set the body yourself. This is basically how error handling is. You just try catch. So eventually, what the goal of Koa is that eventually you're not going to need a lot of this polycode. So you eventually would not need to use code. So this is an example of how in the future you would write Koa apps, with the async and await. I'll go into more depth of how this works, but yeah, that's the goal. So why are we waiting for async await? So there'll be no more nested callbacks. So no more manual error handling. You can try catch finally, and you do not need any third-party libraries. So people will argue about what's the best control flow library. Some people will be like, oh, node fibers or async. So that's what I think is the greatest aspect of this, is that no one will argue anymore. So what's the path to go there, to async await? So what I'm trying to do right now is to have everyone use promises in their libraries, which is really hard because not everyone likes promises. I don't like promises, but I deal with it. Just because I have a vision of async await, where we don't have to deal with any of these problems anymore. So if you're writing a library, try to move to promises. So that's part one of what the goal of Koa is. And next I'm going to go through how the idea of how you build a Koa app. So I don't know how much you guys know Express, but Express is basically just a bunch of callbacks you call into a section. So this is how basically it works. call the first middleware. If there's an error, you call the error handler. Otherwise, you call the next middleware. If there's an error, you call the error handler. So, like I said before, the problem with callbacks is that you have to handle every error. So in every middleware, you're gonna have, if you have an async function, you're gonna have to handle the error. This is how I handle all my errors. If error, return next error. Otherwise, do this. So there are a lot of limitations of using Express and using callbacks. The first is that you can't change the response. So, for example, if you wanted to have a middleware that minifies every HTML response, it's very difficult to do. If you wanted to cache responses based on a condition, for example, if a user is logged in, it's very difficult to do, and especially restricting responses. The Express includes a lot of middleware like compression and sessions, but a lot of those require a lot of monkey patching. So if you look at the code, it's very difficult to understand. Which, if you're a newcomer, it's very hard to learn because it's very hard to understand. And another thing you can't do is execute an asynchronous function after a response is set. So for example, after you send a response, you have a session and you want to save it to the database. Right now, what happens in Express is that you just save it, and if there's an error, you log it. So there's no quick error handling. And if something happens, for example, your database connection gets messed up, the user might end up with a bad session, something bad might go wrong, and you don't know because the error just logged. Nothing crashed, didn't send an error message. You might not even handle your log your errors correctly. There's a lot of issues that could arise. And what a lot of people ask me and us, the Koa and Express team, is what's the difference between Happy, Express, and Koa, and all those other frameworks. So the main difference between Koa and Koa, Express, and Happy is that Happy is a plugin based, where instead of doing any logic, you use a lot of plugins and you just set a lot of options. But the problem with Happy is that there's more overhead to handle all these options. Basically, the frameworks have to actually support every option you want, which is very difficult. And you have to create and use your own plugins, which it will only work within Happy. And Happy uses domains, which is going to be deprecated soon. And many of the features that are available in Express are actually baked into Happy. So the reason why Happy was born was because they were unhappy with Express. They couldn't do a lot of things that I explained. There's a lot of limitations to Express. So they decided, let's make our own framework, which is basically what everyone that works on web development does. And what their main goal is to solve every problem they have with Express. And this is the same thing with Koa, where we're trying to solve problems we have with Express, but in a different way. So, what true the Expressive framework, which Express tried to be, which is why it's called Express, is to allow you to write your own framework without write your own app without relying specifically on the features of a framework. So, for example, with Happy, you have to rely on the framework itself to support what you want to do. Express, not as much, but you still can't do everything you want to do, which is the problem if you want to do very complex apps. So the idea is that you don't want to depend on an API, or you don't want to wait for the framework author to actually create an API for whatever you're trying to do. So the idea behind Koa is that unlike Express, which you basically just callbacks after each other, so I use decorators. So decorators are very confusing to learn. I had a talk before about how it works, but it's very confusing and it's very difficult to understand, like just on slides. So I would recommend that you look up the decorator pattern, if you care. But basically, decorators are functions that wrap other functions, and middleware are just functions. They're not plugins, they're not anything complicated. They're just functions that are executed. So here, this is how a Koa middleware looks like. Each middleware is a generator function, and we have a next. There's no request and response parameters like Express because everything's attached to this, which you might get confused because not everyone in JavaScript knows what the context variable is. So what happens is that this middleware wraps around this middleware. So every middleware wraps around all subsequent middleware. So what happens is that yield next would actually call this middleware function, and then this function will be called after this middleware occurs. So this is how you would unify a response in Koa, which you cannot do you can do in Express, but it's very difficult to do. You basically call yield next, then you do something after you call yield next. So we call this the downstream before you call the next middleware, and we call this the upstream after we call them all subsequent middleware. And this allows us to do whatever we want. This is how we decorate all the middleware, all subsequent middleware. So this is how I like to think about it. Every middleware should be an app. The way I write Koa is every middleware is its own route, and basically each route is basically either an app or a part of an app. So suppose an app all it does is send a page. The way I like to think about middleware is that you add it on top of your app, and you think of the next as another sub app. So you want to do something before you run the sub app, and you do something after you run the sub app. So basically this is a sub app, and all this does is decorate the sub app to minify. So this is how you would write anything like you minify or you compress. So this is how Express differs from Koa. Express, you just pass the control flow, you pass middlewares to each other, and you just pass references to each other. In Koa, it actually wraps it. And the thing about Express is that error handling is just another callback. If an error happens, you call the callback. In Koa, error handlers are just another decorators. They're another middleware that wraps all subsequent middleware. So this is how an error handler would look like. You try catching the yield next. So you try to catch your whole app, and if your whole app breaks, then you send your own response here. So this is an example. Suppose your app threw an error here. You just try to catch it. You catch the error, and you send an error response. So one of the biggest problems with Node are streams, and streams they're basically why there's domains in Node to catch errors thrown by streams, and it's very hard to actually handle and do correctly because there's so many ways you can handle errors in streams. So the great thing about Koa that Express doesn't do and Happy bakes into the framework is that Koa handles all stream errors for you. So every time you set the response body as a stream, it'll actually do all this magic where it'll listen to the errors, and if an error occurs, it'll log it, it'll send a response if a response hasn't been sent, and if the stream is something like has a file descriptor, it'll kill it so there's no leaks. So Node has a lot of stream leaks, and Koa handles all of this through these two main libraries. You can look it up. There's Unfinished that basically wraps streams and wraps streams into a callback so that when a stream initiates, executes a callback, and destroy it, which basically checks if a stream is checks the type of stream and destroys it appropriately, because every type of node stream has different types of file descriptors. So these are different error handling philosophies. Express only allows you to be one error handler, and the idea is that if an error occurs in your app, Express will try to catch it and it'll try to let you handle it, which is not very robust. and it's very hard to customize. For example, if you have an app that's made up of multiple apps, you can't have, it's very difficult to have error handling for each app. In Happy, they do it for you. They use domains, which right now is going to be decorated. So basically, it's a black box for Happy. You don't know exactly what they're going to do and what it entails. And in Koa, you can handle it however you like. You use try catch everywhere. So the way, because of how Koa works, where you write your middleware, you fundamentally, the way you write apps is fundamentally different. So what you do is you start with your business logic. So app.u is my business logic. And say, suppose I want to search static files. In Express, it will be like, where do I place this middleware? Somewhere in the stack, and you have to re-document it. In Koa, you almost always put it on top of your logic. So you always go from the ground up. So let's suppose I want compression now. So I want all my business logic to be compressed, JSDC compressed. And I want all my static files to be compressed as possible. So what you do is you add another wrapper, add another middleware on top of the rest of your app. So this will be your app, and this will be your wrapped app, and compress will wrap both of these middleware. So that's how I like to think about building a Koa app. It's like building a Christmas tree. I don't know if you guys celebrate Christmas here. But you build a tree, you build a foundation, a good foundation, then you decorate, you add features and etc. on top of the foundation. A lot of times when you build with Happy or Express, you're building around the frameworks, which I absolutely hate. For example, in Express, every time you have a middleware, every time you want to add a feature, you got to think, where do I place this, or how do I do this? And sometimes when you do it correctly, you end up with bugs, which is very difficult to debug. But in Koa, you won't ever deal with that problem because it's much easier to think about it. So why should you move from Express to Koa? The number one reason for me is error handling. In Express, you have to do a lot of error handling. And it gets very annoying. You have to write bug-free code, and sometimes your process may crash because you do something incorrectly. With Koa, you never have to deal with that because as long as you don't use streams directly, you won't ever have to worry about that, your process crashing at all. Number two is the async await style control flow. So like I had in the previous slides, the future is going to be where everyone writes these async await and promises. And Koa is a step towards that. And the third step is a decorator pattern, where you could basically do stuff after there's upstream and there's downstream, which Happy and Koa do not support. And it's also much easier to understand, well, for me, than Express or Happy, because in Happy, you basically have to read all 100 pages of documentation. Koa is different in Express and Happy in that it's more of a platform. It's more of a wrapper around the node core. So if you want to do something, you're going to have to look up modules and use them. This is difficult if you're a beginner because you don't know which one's good, you don't know which one, how to use it or how to use them together with other modules. The good thing about Koa and Express is that these same modules, the team we use same modules and the team work together to maintain a shared group of modules. And another problem with Koa is that right now it requires the harmony generators flag in Node. And you have to use an unstable version of Node. Which sucks because if you're a corporation, you don't want to use anything unstable because that means it might break and you don't know why. And what's the difference between Happy, Koa, and Express? Koa is very lean, meaning it doesn't support a lot of things out of the box. And Happy supports a lot of things out of the box. And the purpose of Happy is that a lot of people write the same apps and use the same code. And Happy tries to support all of those use cases so that you don't have to do a lot of module combinations. But that's different with Koa because in Koa, everything is modularized. If you want to do something, you're going to end up with 20, 30 different Koa modules, and you have to learn how to combine them all together. So if you're starting from the ground up, it's a little bit more work. And if you're a team, if you're in a big team, it's very difficult to have everyone be on board. So it depends on your situation. When to use Koa, Happy, or Express. If you're a new team, new JavaScript, I would suggest you just still use Express because it's simpler and there's more documentation on Express than Koa because Koa is very new. So here's the use cases for Koa. The best thing with Koa is that it's for JSON APIs because it supports JSON as first-class citizen. If you have so what I like to do when I enter a team is to refactor the model because the model is very important. That's where all your business is. And usually when I refactor it, I like to use promises because it's, if you have business logic, you're probably gonna have a lot of async calls, and promise helps out, and you can't use generators yet. But if you already refactored to use promises in your app, I would recommend using Koa because it makes everything very easy to use. And Koa is good if you have complex or unconventional sites. So, for example, Happy is used for an e-commerce, so basically a store. But if you want to build something more like something no one else really solved, I would recommend Koa because you have more power of how everything works. But the biggest problem with Koa is it's very difficult to learn. There's a steep learning curve. You have to know promises. Well, you don't have to learn promises, but you should learn promises because that's the long-term goal. You have to know generators, which I didn't even explain because it's very confusing. It'll take me like a week or 2 weeks to understand, and you guys will not be able to understand in one lecture. It's very modular. So like I said before, you have to mix and match 20, 30 modules just to make an app running. But the great thing is that you have a lot of customization. And Koa is very low level, where you actually have to do a lot of HTTP. You have to set the headers yourself. Well, you don't have to, but you should. And the difference between that and Express and Happy is that they handle it for you, where they extract it into a send file abstraction or something. And Koa doesn't really have that baked in. You have to use modules for that, which is more learning. So yeah, that's my lecture, my talk. Anyone have any questions? Yeah.
I have a question. Thanks for the talk. So it looks like Express and Koa have very different philosophies of solving asynchronous problems. And in Koa, it seems like it's trying to make asynchronous looks like a procedural problem. So may I know what kind of a decision to make Koa looks like this? And also, is callback, nested callback really a problem in Express?
So Express, it never tried to solve the global problem, at least yet. It's just, back then no one used callbacks, so Express is based on callbacks. That's really it. We're thinking of ways to improve Express via promises, maybe async away too, but it's a little bit more difficult. When TJ wasn't happy with Express with the reasons I explained, so he wrote Koa, and with generators is the way to solve the callback problem. And that's just what he decided. So, and it really is only a way to solve it right now. I mean, because everyone wants to have code that looks looks synchronous. I don't think there's any other solution. There's people try to do node fibers, which is very similar to generators and coroutines, but it requires you to install C++ add-on, which is very hard to do because it's slow and it breaks on different platforms. So this is the easiest way because it's just all language features. And what's the last one? The callbacks. Like I said before, like it's not that it's a big problem, but if you want to do it correctly, it becomes very difficult to do because you have to handle all your errors. You have to refactor a lot, and it's very hard to move fast when you have to do everything correctly like that. So the good thing about Koa is that when you use generators and promises, you could ignore errors for now, and later on you just try catch and handle them manually. With Express, you're gonna have to basically handle every error immediately. And another problem is, like I said before, conditionals. I don't want to show it because it's very difficult to understand. But basically, you have to refactor a lot if you have conditionals. For me, I had very complex business logic. If this, do that, and it'll go very less deeply. And it's very difficult to do with callbacks, and it requires you to do a lot of refactoring. Basically split every asynchronous like calls into separate functions, etc. And it took a lot of time. It really takes a lot of time to do. It takes a lot of time to maintain. But when you use promises and generators, it's a lot easier to do. Yeah.
How do you think about the Express transfer to strong loop?
Wait, I didn't understand you.
How do you think about Express transfer to strong loop?
Oh, Express going strong loop?
Yeah. Who owns Express now?
Okay. So I don't know if you guys know, but TJ actually sold Express to Strong Loop. So Strong Loop is there's like a few companies that are like fighting like for the node ecosystem, for branding, because they're all consulting companies. Strong Loop is one of them. So they bought Express from TJ. And I think TJ expected them to actually maintain it, but they didn't end up maintaining it. So right now the person maintaining Express is Doug Wilson. He's amazing because he basically maintains all the modules like Koa, Express, and Happy uses some of them too. He maintains all of them, and he's the one that checks the RFC specifications and makes sure everything he does is correct. So right now he's maintaining Express, or he was before too. There was some drama, and I guess they resolved it. I don't know exactly how, but I think it's because they actually hired people to do documentation. And that's still a good way to help maintain open source project. And I think after that he started maintaining Express again, like officially. So personally, I think it's just stupid because you can't find an open source project. But I mean, I don't like dealing with drama, so I try to avoid all that stuff. Okay. Thank you. You don't have any questions? Okay. Questions? No, I don't have the...
Okay, if a newbie of the Node.js, how do you recommend they have to from the Express story or from Koa?
Yeah, so I said a little bit earlier, if you're new in Node, and if you're working by yourself, I would recommend Express. I'll probably recommend Express because it's simpler. If you're working on a team and you're brand new, I'll recommend Happy just because they have a lot of documentation. And it's more plugin based, so you basically switch things just on and off. With Express, you have to do more logic. I would only really recommend Koa after you learn Express or another framework and you know a lot of JavaScript because it requires ES6. ES6 is still very new and it's not finalized. So yeah, Koa is advanced. So and it's much more complicated to do. But once you learn how to do it, it makes writing apps very easy.
Does anyone have a question? Okay, and then thanks for Jonathan for the speech. Let's give him a big applause. And then we will have a 20 minutes break, and the next section will be separated to conference room. 在这边跟大家提醒一下，您的同步口预计请不要开得太大声，这样可能会影响其他的来宾。那如果有想要领取食物的话，请到2楼的服务处。另外，等一下下午场1点10分将会有Centra公司的 workshop， 请大家可以积极参与。那最后一场在第2会议厅有闪光夏先生，最后还有开放的来宾可以上台分享一些经验。那请在外面的门上有一个海报，可以直接写你的名字上去报名。